guys, welcome to my ASMR channel. This is actually take two, because I was having some microphone troubles. I figured it better to increase the gain, and here's my cat. Also, she was knocking everything over because she needs attention, but when I pick her up, then she doesn't want any attention anymore. Her name is Kutu, and she's from Saudi Arabia. Yeah, so I guess there's some background noise now, but that's better than you not being able to hear me because I'm being nice and relaxed and quiet for you so that you can be nice and relaxed for my ASMR ramble style story time research proposal. I'm going to start out, I think, with a little anecdote that I tell everyone all the time, which was that I came to Colorado to teach 7th graders at a charter school. It was a KIP school, Knowledge is Power program. Don't teach there if you can help it. They tend to hire 23-year-old teachers who don't have any frame of reference for what other schools are like, because they like to burn you out, and I have disabling chronic pain, and they were super into all the performative allyship around it, but not into actually having me work less than 60 plus hours a week. I was there from dark to dark, and this was right after quarantine, so the students socially, emotionally, they were not quite where other 7th graders have been that I've taught. I've tutored 7th graders on and off for years and years and years. I'm old. I'm 32. Taught them for at least 8 years, but these 7th graders would just scream when they were overstimulated and that kind of thing. That was a little bit stressful, and I'm, after my first year of teaching, I don't really take a whole lot of things personally as far as what the students do. So I guess it was just the noise of the screaming that was stressful, and I wasn't annoyed individually by the students screaming. So this one student was writing, and he was complaining about English spelling, because not everyone can be me, who won a college level spelling bee, because my background is in the source languages to English, and English spelling is different depending on the source language of the word. So, I told him, well, Spanish is Spanish, as you can see, right over here. This map, the branches of the Indo-European language family are proportional to their number of speakers. So you can see English is the largest one over there. I should have mirrored my video. English is the largest, Spanish is the second largest, Hindi, and the other kind of Indian subcontinent languages are, quite big themselves. And then there's little German, trusty German, right over here. And here's my microphone that I use to teach languages with, so it has to pick up, subtle differences in pronunciation. Anyway, wait, when I clicked no, okay, never mind. Spanish is spelled a lot more phonetically than English is. It's spelled pretty consistently. I remember another time I asked a student to spell the word name up on the board, and he spelled it N-E-I-M, which is actually how it's spelled in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So I was not going to tell him that he was spelling it wrong. I just told him it wasn't the dictionary spelling. But the student who was getting frustrated with how English was spelled, I just told him, if you don't know how to spell a word in English, just spell it like it's Spanish, because it's so phonetic. I don't know Spanish, but I would be able to read it. And somehow that just made him immediately start writing, despite his lost handful of years of emotional maturity and everything. He was developmentally more at like a 5th grade level in terms of how he would respond to stuff. And later, when I started taking pedagogical theory, because that job was really bad and burned me out, and I will get back to charter schools later, because this is tangentially related, and I'm allowed to go on tangents because I'm allowed to be creative with this assignment. And this assignment is currently in an ASMR ramble style format. So when I started studying pedagogical theory, it turned out that was a culturally responsive intervention in the classroom. And when you study pedagogical theory, you're basically just encouraged to do these kind of like little micro interventions in the classroom, in order to not invalidate a student's cultural assets and experiences in favor of the cultural assets and experiences that you personally might have grown up with and that you personally recognize. I'm gonna give another anecdote right now, because it kind of, as a guy who not only beat a college level spelling bee, but also was gifted, talented in school before they knew what to do with gifted, talented kids. I can tell you that the whole gifted, talented thing is it's a psyop. It's totally made up. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but I think a good example is the global service learning teacher that I was TAing for during one of my teaching internships was a really cool guy, and his wife actually taught race and gender studies at community college, and one of the things I did with him was adapt a lesson on bell hooks for 8th graders and for 12th graders, and surprisingly the 8th graders understood it a little bit better, but also maybe that's just because it was my second revision of the lesson. But he pointed out when he was teaching in California, the Chicano kids were effectively trilingual because they would speak English fluently, Spanish fluently, and their native American language fluently. They were entirely conversationally proficient in these 3 languages, but because their English did not conform to standardized English, which we'll get into, they got put into remedial English classes, whereas a student like me, or some other likely white middle or upper class student who was taking a foreign language and could get good scores on their foreign language tests without actually speaking the language would end up in gifted talented because, you know, A pluses in your Latin or French class or whatever. That means you're gifted talented. But being able to actually talk to people in 3 languages, that's a call for remediation, because you're probably the way people organically learn languages is they're all mixed together. Little kids don't know. Sorry if I'm preaching to the choir and you're already bilingual or plurilingual, but little kids don't know that they're speaking multiple languages until other people point it out, and then they kind of have to figure out like how to sequester one language from the other. But they also already have that partially figured out because people naturally change language registers, which is how you would articulate yourself in different contexts. So to bilingual or multilingual kids, multiple languages are just different registers for different contexts, different cultural contexts. And because of that, they're pretty smart. I mean, you can problematize IQ all day, but there are certain points where it's useful, where you're, for example, comparing two. If you've got your variables controlled, and you're comparing 2 populations that are otherwise identical, bilingual kids have a higher IQ, and they have a higher what's called common underlying proficiency in languages. So that just means they're better at expressing themselves with language. One of the points of what I would like to instruct students with regard to this research proposal is that the purpose of language has been for about 17,000 years, as far as we can tell, to actually communicate and not to adhere to a specific standardized version of a language. We have standardized versions of languages now because we have nation states, and we have nation states now because that's another psyop. What treaty was it that established Treaty of not Luxembourg, one of those other ones. Oh, Treaty of Westphalia. I mean, like, so there is a utility to having a certain standard language. To some extent, like when we got railroads, we had to standardize clocks a little bit, and we had to standardize how far apart the railroad ties were, and everything like that. And it's helpful to have a register of a language that is comprehensible to all speakers within a certain region. But that does not necessarily mean that all speakers in that region have to actually speak it. And that's another thing I might get back to later, if I remember. A good example would be Indonesian. Indonesians are very good at learning other languages because Standard Indonesian is an extremely simplified version of this kind of like broader Malaysian language spectrum, and they likely grew up in a household that did not speak Standard Indonesian, and if they did, they still are still poised to learn other languages because Indonesian is a very regular language, very easy to pick up, probably a good way to build your common underlying language proficiency from the very beginning. Another such language is Swahili, and I'll get back to that later too, because that has a little bit something to do with the development. It has parallels with certain developments in English. So anyway, I did this culturally responsive intervention in the classroom where I told the kid, just write it like it would be Spanish. And he did, and that was perfectly fine. And that got rid of any of his what we call language anxiety, which overlaps a lot with stereotype threat. So an example of stereotype threat that I've heard of is a study where they administered the same test to black and white students. And the control group, they didn't say anything, and black and white students got the same scores. In the non-control group, sorry, it's bedtime right now. I should know what the other group is called. I promise I do, but I want to do this little, cozy ASMR experience. And that's totally why I'm not saying, dependent variable group or whatever. So when they were administering this test to black and white students, they said, and this is true of tests. I have tutored the SAT to, for example, Arabic-speaking students who, because of certain cultural differences, were not as able to, as ready to answer certain questions as an English speaker. For example, whoever wrote the test assumed that you would know that Allie was a girl's name. But the pronouns were ambiguous after that. Is it he or she? And my student read it as Ali. So she was very confused when it said she afterward, and she was like, "Who's the she in this question?" And it's not Ali, it's Allie, as in Allison. So when they administered this test, they said, black students have been shown to score slightly lower on this test. But don't worry, that's no indicator of intelligence. This test has also been shown to have a cultural bias, and that is why black students score lower on the test. However, as you can probably guess from the premise of this study, black students still scored lower when they were told that black students scored lower on this culturally biased test. And the idea is that when you encounter stereotype threat, you get very preoccupied with not reinforcing certain stereotypes of, whatever identity you might belong to. But in that preoccupation, that actually ends up impacting your performance. So, when that comes to language anxiety, and English as a prestige language, you'll get this all the time in, I'm told, especially East Asia, where people will say, "Oh, your Korean is very good," and your Korean will be only a couple phrases, and the other person will be able to say the full sentence, "Your Korean is very good." might even be able to carry on a conversation. For me, in Germany, if you ask someone, excuse me, do you speak English? They will say a little bit, which might mean they speak almost none, or they're perfectly fluent. But because English is a prestige language, they aren't going to say, yes, actually, I do speak English. So, when it comes to the research proposal, I was wondering, like, what if we just taught students this in the beginning of the year? And we could start with English language learner classrooms, even though classrooms ideally should be integrated between already kind of fluent native speakers and which really we should call them monolinguals, and non-native speakers, English learners. But those classes are still not often integrated, and especially less proficient students in English will end up in classes where they are, supposed to just study English vocabulary and grammar, and that sets them behind sometimes in their other classes, unless you deliberately put them in math classes that they would otherwise be proficient in their native language. So actually, this overlaps with my other class. I'm designing a unit on this kind of early intervention theory. What if English language learners learned that standard English is a psyop and not real and fake, and it exists to basically oppress English language learners? What if they learned that in like the second week of school? First week, you do like a rapport building week. Everyone learns each other's names and hobbies, and like students establish like where they're going to be sitting and like who they generally are going to sit with, and the teacher is going to figure out whether or not those students should actually sit with each other or not. But before you actually get to English instruction, what if you teach students through like a handful of, essential questions and lesson targets? That the purpose of any language is to communicate, and not to be right. And I feel that one of the biggest issues with this entire premise is that when you talk to English language arts teachers, their background is usually in English or in teaching. It's not in linguistics, so they won't necessarily know that language should be described, not prescribed. The unit would be on kind of disillusioning students with the notion of linguistic prescriptivism, which is when you say a language has to be a certain way. Really, you can only do that with dead languages. You can say, oh, a Roman would have said this, but not this, because, well, we can say they would have written this, but not this, because we have enough documented evidence to show that they might not have had these certain noun forms, even though the noun should be regular or something like that. Also, just like regular expressions and stuff, you obviously can't directly translate expressions. between languages if one of the languages is dead. Um, if you're doing this between living languages, you've probably heard a language learner literally translate an expression to you. In Arabic, this is particularly interesting because there are a lot of expressions that are either identical or very, very close to English because Arabic, the Arabic language and the culture, they kind of place a very high prestige on knowing a lot of proverbs. So they don't say a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. They say a bird in the hand is worth two in the tree, I believe. And if I'm talking to a German, they will say, "Oh, it's a and they will go, it's a fist rule. It's not an exact rule. It's a fist rule." And Faustregel is our rule of thumb. And I always tell them, oh, in English, it's rule of thumb because it's so close that they usually think that that's kind of cool. Anyway, that's called translanguaging when you use your proficiency in other languages to help communicate in other languages. And it is the norm across the world. I cannot emphasize enough that being monolingual in America is very much not the norm. And not only is it not the norm, but the fact that we have very few dialects and very few accents in America compared to like the UK, where you can't swing a cat without there's my cat over there. You can't swing a cat without encountering a different regional dialect, including some dialects that do not have a common ancestor in English, going back maybe more than 1,500 years. It's just because those dialects were next to each other for more than 1,000 years, they are mutually intelligible, which has to do with polycentrism, language polycentrism, which is one solution to the puzzle of cultural hegemony, language hegemony, and the other aspect of that being language receptive multilingualism, which is another solution to just offering one standard dialect. So I'm going to keep using Arabic examples because I lived in Saudi Arabia for 2 years. Most of my students say they failed Arabic or they didn't learn proper Arabic, which means they didn't learn Fusha, which is standard Arabic, which is based on a combination of 16 dead dialects and classical Quranic Arabic. So of course they didn't pass it because the grammar is complicated as heck, and most Arabic learners, such as myself, looking at a textbook, will also be forced to learn Fusha, even though even native Arabic speakers consistently fail that class. However, because, for example, Moroccan Arabic and Saudi Arabic are not mutually intelligible, Moroccans and Saudis can both understand standard Arabic, and it's used in newspapers and news broadcasts, kind of the same way like very posh English is used in the BBC, except it's a totally different dialect. It's not just people speaking like the royals do. Although in Saudi Arabia, the royals do actually try to approximate Fusha, because it's more formal, it's more prestigious, and it indicates a higher socioeconomic status, as standardized dialects do. However, let me throw out another concept here. There's a difference between minority dialects and minoritized dialects. So, every dialect is technically a minority dialect. There are no majority dialects of a language. It would be exceedingly bizarre. Maybe you could have like a majority dialect if a language had like 300 speakers and 200 of them were in one village and they all spoke one dialect, and 100 of them were in another village and they all spoke another dialect. But for example, I had a colleague in the English teaching business who was from, I think, the Midwest, and he would say broke, break, broke, not break, broke, broken. But he was white, and he went to college, and a pretty nice college, and he was like middle or upper middle class and had pretty decent like social connections and stuff. So, as English teachers, we pointed it out, but among English speakers, he would not be considered to have a minoritized dialect, like a Chicano English speaker or an African American vernacular English speaker would. Those are minoritized, even though often they make up larger chunks of the English language than random whiteisms that you might encounter in various places in the U.S. Let me just go on record, because this is an existing misconception that I have encountered, very recently. And if you have a closed-minded uncle or whatever, they might believe that certain varieties of English are more ignorant than others. Number one, even if your vocabulary is smaller than another speaker's, that means you are going to use more nonverbal communication, which is something that I want to watch out for in my research study, because that's a sign of language proficiency. Whereas if you're like me and both your parent and your mom was an English major and your dad went to grad school for library science, your vocabulary is a bit turgid, and you don't really use a whole lot of body language to express yourself. Instead, you use words like turgid. Much to my own alienation, at the hands of my peers, who are much better at body language because they didn't have an outsized vocabulary by the time they were 5. It doesn't matter how many words you know, unless you want adults to think you're smart when you're a little kid. But then by the time you're an adult, it's really just showboating, right? Anyway, where was I going with this? Let me see. Oh, yeah. So, African American Vernacular English actually has a more complicated aspect system. So tense is when something takes place, when a verb takes place. Aspect is how finished an action is. So I have washed my hands is actually the present perfect. The tense is the present because it's describing the present. But it's the perfect in that it describes a finished action, in that your hands are washed. I had washed my hands is the past perfect. I will have washed my hands is the future perfect, and my hands will have been being washed by me is the future passive perfect progressive. So, African American Vernacular English, in case you don't know, has something called the habitual be. The study that they did on black kids was actually pretty interesting. They used Sesame Street. They said, okay, it was a picture of Cookie Monster, who at the time was not eating cookies, and a picture of Elmo, who at the time was eating a cookie. And they asked the kids, okay, who is eating a cookie? And the black kids consistently answered Elmo. And then they asked, who be eating cookies? And the black kids consistently answered Cookie Monster, because Cookie Monster indeed do be eating cookies. But white kids didn't understand the question and just gave random answers based on what they expected the adults to get out of them. So that is an aspect of English that does not exist in standard English. So it represents a habitual state of a verb, and we don't communicate that in standard English. I communicate in a very kind of standard English because, like I said, my parents are nerds, and they both came from different parts of the country, and they both kind of attempted to neutralize their accents when they moved to New York. So I just have this kind of vague, city-ish accent. East Coast maybe, but like most people in Denver will speak similarly. City English is very close no matter where you are. All right. Next topic. Next ramble. Next bit of story time. Let me see. It's all in my head. I've got it all laid out. Yeah, we talked about this. Okay. Let me just say a thing or two about language hegemony, because I was talking about standard English and how that's generally recognized as more correct and that kind of thing. So cultural hegemony is a theory proposed by Antonio Gramsci, who is one of the many Marxist thinkers who addressed capitalist ideology after Marx and Engels addressed historical materialism. And Engels himself said after Marx's death that they would have talked a lot more about ideology if everyone at the time wasn't already explaining history through a purely ideological lens. And as a student of ancient history in undergrad, you kind of have to be a historical materialist regardless of your politics, because so much of what we know is from archaeology, which is literally historical materialism. You can't really make up a bunch of grand ideological narratives about Greece and Rome, at least not with sound contemporary scholarship. The people who do likely don't actually know anything about Greece or Rome. So another example of why standard English is wrong is that a lot of the rules we have in standard English right now are only 100 years old, and they come from Latin grammarians who not only were racist and trying to establish a dialect that kind of distinguished them from the people that English speakers were colonizing and who were learning English differently, but also their classical education was incomplete because they would correct people about using things like double negatives when, if they had studied ancient Greek, they would know that some languages set off negation clauses, some languages and dialects. For example, African American Vernacular English. Nobody didn't do that. Is something you would say in ancient Greek, because you are setting off a negation clause. You have to negate everything in the clause in order for it to be a negation. You don't say, no, somebody didn't do that, because who's the somebody? That doesn't make sense. It's nobody didn't do that. And then we get into other ridiculous made-up rules, like, well, I mean, all of these rules are made up because they are prescribing how the language should go. A good example of a descriptive rule to English is how we arrange adjectives. It's not something you learn in school, but it's something that most English speakers exhibit. So we say, the big red Persian rug. We don't say the big Persian red rug or the red big Persian rug. There's like a dozen different categories of adjective that all go in specific places when we list adjectives, and while it might indicate that someone is an English learner if they, put those in the wrong order, it's also an example of, perfectly fine receptive kind of trans-languaging that you can perfectly understand someone no matter which order they put those adjectives in. So, yeah, one of the prescriptive rules devised by some random Latin nerd 100 years ago is that you can't end a sentence with a preposition because it's called a preposition, but that's something we actually do all the time because we speak English here. As you can see, it belongs to the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. Greek also does this. You can separate verbs, phrasal verbs, from the main verb and the thing that looks like a preposition. And quite frankly, this is an old joke, but this whole not ending sentences with a preposition is something that I will not put up with. I'll wait for your laughter and applause. Anyway. Let me check some of the studies that I haven't had the chance to explain in my final draft yet. It's a little bit tricky because I put my camera kind of right in front of my screen so that it would be like I was making eye contact with you the whole time. Okay. Actually, I just remembered another little thing I wanted to tell you guys. So there's this thing called fossilization where when you reach the point of what we would call an intermediate plateau, which is where you can say basically everything you need to say. I call it conversational competency or language competency, but not fluency. That's basically where I'm at with German. When you're at this intermediate plateau, you don't necessarily need to become fluent in a language, and people who are learning a language for reasons, other than prestige, people who are learning a language that might be of a kind of lower socioeconomic status than theirs or something like that, once they become proficient but not fluent, that might be where they stop learning. In the modern day, when languages are at, well, less so now, but have been taught just using mostly grammar and vocabulary. Once you reach this kind of point of intermediate plateau, that's when you kind of have to start talking to native speakers in order to improve your language. So the other group of people who become fluent after reaching an intermediate plateau, even if they don't necessarily feel the need, are people who, for example, marry into a different language because they'll be speaking with their spouse or their family, or even if they just move to a village, that amount of exposure will lead them to fluency beyond just competency. Generally, not always, because fossilization is completely fine. And here's an example. English. England was invaded many times. It had a couple of big invasions about once every 500 years. Really, can I see this? Can I see what I have over here? Okay. Yeah, English comes from the Anglo-Frisian branch. Right over there. But more significantly, England was invaded by a bunch of different Germanic tribes. And a lot of them were kind of separate enough that they spoke uh, different languages, or rather different dialects. But they all reach this point of fossilization between each other, where they used what they had in common in order to speak what we now know as English. So, English within this broad, really big language tree has, as you might know, if you know like Spanish or pretty much any other language, English doesn't have that much morphological change. The nouns especially don't really change their form that much. Like, we have thing and things. We only have a couple of irregular plurals, and we only mark like object in pronouns, and only sometimes, and we don't decline our articles. We only have the. We don't have the and then some form of the for the object, like Spanish or German or any of these other languages have, and that's because the different Germanic tribes that invaded England around the 5th and 6th centuries, they all had different these. But the thing that those these had in common was the little the part. And then there were endings and stuff, but they just kept the. And that was part of English becoming actually quite regular. So another example, we can go back to Swahili, which started as a trade language between Bantu African speakers and Arabic speakers. So now Swahili is actually very easy to learn because it doesn't have all the complicated grammar of Arabic, but it does have all the very common Arabic like words that have kind of been passed around the world based on Arab trade routes in the Middle Ages, making Swahili very easy for like African Bantu speakers, Arabic speakers, and in fact, like pretty much any language speaker. There's a good chance that you would have an easier time learning Swahili than you would a language that is closely related to your native language. One of the things I hope to teach in my unit, one of the main kind of learning objectives of the unit that I will be asking students about at the end of the unit, and in particular asking my my close interview students about, is this concept that England got invaded multiple times. First by the Romans. That language didn't really stick around. There aren't a whole lot of Latin words in English from before the German invasions. There are now, because of those Latin nerds that I was talking about before. They put those words in, and you might notice that we already have words for most of the Latin words in English, like for art, which is from Latin. We also have words like craft and skill. Craft spoken skill would be the kind of Germany versions that people would have spoken before. A Latin nerd said, actually, why don't we start saying art as well? And that's why I, as a dude with a kind of patrilineal name of Skillman from England, have the name Skillman and not Artman. Anyway, at a certain point in time, art, craft, and skill would have been pretty much very close synonyms that were spoken in different regions of the British Island. But as power was consolidated on Britain, they all developed different shades of meaning. And this is another thing you can see in Arabic, is the kind of different dialects consolidated. And you have words from like Persian or Berber languages, and you'll have like 12 different words for jaguar or something, or lion. There are many, many words for lion, and they do have kind of different, slightly different connotations. The way we have connotational differences between, for example, this is a connotational difference I learned in. We did this in 12th grade. Naked and nude. For some reason, that was the example that my English speaker chose. Anyway, the denotation, which is like what the word denotes, how the dictionary entry would look, is pretty much the same. But the way you would use it in a social context in different registers is different. Much like I was saying, bilingual kids see like one of their languages as contextually, socially different from another. Let me see. I want to get all these stories out of the way because I'm allowed to, and I'm not allowed to do that in my final draft of the project. And this is a whole lot of background information that I wish I could share with my students, but they would probably fall asleep, which is why this is an ASMR video, because it will probably put you to sleep too. Okay, so to get this out of the way, I forget if it's Wida or Wida. My uncle's a principal who is anti-teacher union, and he knows if it's Wida or Wida. Anyway, that's some kind of Wisconsin assessment for English proficiency, and it's actually fairly progressive because it does attempt to measure English proficiency based on ability to communicate, but it is very difficult to assess a language without establishing some kind of standard. So when you read about teaching English and where teaching standard English falls within developing English proficiency, it's actually to get students to recognize that standard English is a specific register, a specific socially contingent register of English that you have to use in certain contexts, like writing an email in your office office, or writing your resume or a cover letter, or stuff like that. Sometimes speaking in the office, you'll want to be a little bit more standard English, but even there, it's not the same. And we have tools like Grammarly and spell check now for that kind of thing, which is actually good. Because another thing I would tell my students that they were a little bit more confused about, but that they also got kind of confident about spelling with, was when I told them that spelling was invented to sell dictionaries, which is not untrue. As for dictionaries in like the early 1800s, would say, oh, you're gonna look pretty stupid if you don't spell this word right. And now words are spelled right because we have mass communication, so we might as well spell things in these very arbitrary ways. For example, colonel instead of colonel. Colonel is the French spelling, but we use the Spanish pronunciation, and it just ended up in the dictionary like that. But now you're spelling it wrong. If you spell colonel with an R. So that's all stuff that happened in the early 1800s. Yeah, around the same time you would be selling I don't know, maybe you've played Red Dead Redemption 2, snake oil and that kind of thing. Dictionaries are just another form of snake oil. We've gone from 300 years ago spelling things how they sounded to spelling things using a dictionary to spelling things how they sound and then using spell check. So it just came back around because if you're spelling a living language, you're probably going to be spelling it the way it sounds to you. Not only that, but if you're spelling a dead language, you're probably going to be pronouncing it the way it's spelled, because you might not know how it was originally pronounced, or you might just assume that they were spelling it in the way that they would pronounce it, which we also kind of know for a fact that that's not true, because there's a lot of Roman graffiti with spelling errors in it, and the confusion, so-called confusion in Spanish, goes back to Roman times. There's an ancient Roman expression that in Hispania, bibera est vivere, which means in Spain, to live is to drink, because vivere is the same. That's biber to drink, and viver to live. I don't know if they actually drank a lot in ancient Roman Spain, but bivera est vivere. Anyway. Anyway, you should try studying some Latin. It's really not as stuffy as some may lead you to believe. There are a lot more swear words in it than you would expect. It's a much more vulgar in terms of rude language than Victorians would probably hope you would get the impression of. that if you look at, open source dictionaries that are more than 100 years old for Latin and Greek, they will dodge the definitions of certain words that are very clearly explicit in both senses of the word. But before English was standardized, it was called a vulgar language, which comes from a Latin word, which just means common or popular. So English was the vulgar tongue. If you play Dungeons and Dragons, you might be familiar with the fact that the most commonly spoken language in Faerun is called Common, which is a reference to the notion that English was the vulgar tongue, back when the correct language to be spoken was Latin. However, here is where prescriptivism and descriptivism come into conflict, because when Charlemagne conquered, a giant chunk of Europe, he realized, the guys over here on this side of Europe are speaking a really different Latin from the guys on the other side of Europe, and how is God gonna understand them, though? How's God gonna understand them if their Latin is wrong? Because this is the Holy Roman Catholic Church under the Holy Roman Empire, and yet they're saying things like in nomine patria, in name fatherland. What does that even mean? It should be in the name of the Father. So Charlemagne, who was himself illiterate, demanded that Latin spelling be standardized. Back in that century, I think. Third? No. Much later than that. 5th or 6th century. When was Charlemagne alive? Anyway, doesn't matter. I'm not a medieval historian. I just know that he also invented punctuation in capital letters, or he commissioned punctuation in capital letters to be invented, which was very helpful. Also, spaces between words, very helpful. Very helpful for distinguishing the Latin, so that you could talk to God correctly, and because Latin then became a prescribed language, the occupants of the Holy Roman Empire realized, we're speaking Old French. They didn't say Old French, because at the time it was not old. Or we're speaking Old Spanish, and that kind of thing. And that was really when the distinction between those languages, emerged at all. So you can see that dividing languages that really always exist on a spectrum is also always more politically motivated. It's a hegemonic impulse. It doesn't come from specific objective rules of language. There's a Yiddish expression that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, because I hope we don't have a bunch of Balkans in the audience, or if we do, I hope we have progressive transnational Balkans who acknowledge that Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin, and Kosovar are basically all the same language with different dialects, as are most of the Scandinavian languages are mutually intelligible as well. But they count as separate languages because they all have their own countries. So they all have their own, they all wield their own political influence and power. They are not polycentric languages. They are dictated from a specific source of political power. A polycentric language would be like Malaysian, where you have a language like Indonesian, which belongs to another center, or Bengali is a polycentric language because it belongs to two countries. There is West Bengal in India, and then there is Bangladesh. And there is no central authority deciding which Bengali language is correct. Well, since we're on the topic of polycentrism, and I've given you a brief overview of these invasions of England, we might as well talk about Scots. So Scots is actually not English. This is an example of one of those languages I was talking about that existed in such close parallel to English for so long that it is mutually intelligible with English. We can understand Scottish people, and Scottish people can understand us, but a lot of the words that sound very similar that we interpret to be maybe the same word are often not even directly related. However, to this day, you will hear Scottish people legitimately, with legitimacy, they are right in complaining about this, that they are simply told that Scottish is not proper English, and in their schools they are taught to speak English. As I've said before, a clear solution to this would be what we would call receptive multilingualism, which is basically how we already understand Scottish. We don't speak Scots, we understand Scots. Scottish people, hopefully, if they're cool, don't speak proper English. They speak Scots, and they can fully understand English. It just kind of comes into, it becomes an issue when they have to talk to, speech recognition software, which is another example of language hegemony, actually. Because the tech bros who decided that Alexa would only recognize certain dialects of English forgot that Scottish people exist. Actually, at least they did include Indian English, which makes a whole lot of sense. Indian English is a good example of a minoritized dialect because, as you may know from this tree over here, this side of the tree, there are a lot of people in India, and a whole lot of them speak English more so than people in England. The same goes for the Philippines, and something that I want to deliver in my unit my kind of early intervention anti-prescriptivism unit is that you look at these minoritized language speakers, such as Indian English speakers and Filipino English speakers, and they have just as much a right to English as you do or I do. Particularly you in the English language learner classroom context. Because, people were allowed to invade England and change English many, many times over the centuries. But then, when England invaded everybody, for some reason, England decided that the people they invaded were not allowed to change English. And yet, somehow, it's happening anyway. I could probably talk a lot more about culturally sustaining pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching. Culturally sustaining pedagogy, speaking of the tree, is kind of an offshoot of culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching is a little bit more self-evident, but like I said, it's usually taught as just in-class single-moment interventions. Culturally sustaining pedagogy specifically aims to not delete certain cultures, because deleting cultures is bad. The example that I give in my research project is the extinction of Native American languages, in an effort to erase Native American cultures. It's part of the larger cultural and literal genocide of Native Americans, that Native American languages were deliberately killed off in order to erase a sense of identity among Native American tribes. Not only that, but Native American cuisine has to be reconstructed based on just vague hints in textbooks and oral tradition from very old people. Maybe some of the same people who are maybe some of the two surviving speakers of some native language. But as you might have noticed, the fact that this is still going on, the fact that England still finds the need to correct Scottish people, kind of goes into colonial theory, and shows that colonization is an ongoing process. I don't know if you've been checking the news, but that's all I'll say about that for now. I'm not gonna get into that bit. But colonization is not a one and done type thing unless you have a successful genocide. When the Nazis invaded Eastern Europe, some of the higher ups said it was not feasible to Germanize most of Eastern Europe, and the response to that from other higher ups was, look at America, look at this monoculture they created across an entire continent, and they were unfortunately kind of of right about that. Uh, I feel like in order to reestablish any kind of sense of real history in America, we need to unerase uh, native cultures. Um, I feel like there is a deep sense of alienation that is part of the colonial process, in that it enforces a kind of social atomization among people, because we do not have the sense of history in the US. Instead, we have the sense of a monolithic culture that, because it covers an entire continent, many Americans confuse with human nature, and not with just their culture as any other culture might be. Anyway, that's why I want to leave the U.S. That's another reason I want to leave the U.S. because this is actually something that that I vibed with the Chicano students with in my second teaching internship, which was surprising to me because we have very different backgrounds, but when I talked to them about how, when I lived overseas in my 20s and I picked up non-American cultural things that I preferred to do. Eye contact in Arab countries is considered very intense, and I agree with them about that. Uh, it's an arbitrary social thing that we choose to pathologize in the U.S. as some kind of symptom of neurodivergence, whereas in Arab countries you are simply allowed to not make eye contact with people and still be friends with them. So, when I talked to my students about this, we had a unit on westward expansion. We were talking about kind of like, American cultural hegemony, America presenting itself as a monolithic culture. And I mentioned that I have some culture things that I picked up that Americans just consider unnatural. It's not that I do things differently, it's that I do things weirdly and probably wrongly to a lot of Americans, especially the no offense to the chunk of Americans who have never left their hometown, but that kind of American might, if they don't like me for some reason, because I'm generalizing about Americans who have never left their hometown, they might see me as weird for some reason. And I don't know, I just got these knowing nods from like more than half the class when I said that, because they also have the experience of being basically pathologized, and I mean, every culture is that has xenophobia is going to alienate people based on differences, but other cultures are aware that other cultures exist. American culture is, I feel like, uniquely isolated in this way, which is why, which is another reason why we need to apply critical theory specifically to these notions of prescriptivism and descriptivism, because the idea that there is a right and wrong in English is just simply the default epistemology, underlying epistemology of English currently. Oh man, there's so much more stuff I could talk about. I feel like I'll get points off if I I don't mention my methodology. So like I said, I will be targeting these students. I will be targeting students that exist in this intermediate plateau who, you know, even just like learning a language from native speakers, if you've been kind of just studying it more so from books, that's a different study skill. So the WIDA access tests, the intermediate plateau there is like levels 3 and 4. In most normal sized schools, you'll have like 10-15 students throughout the school that are at that level at any given point in time. So these students are a good candidate for a kind of more in-depth interview type situation, which is something that I generally like to do about language learners. I don't know if you've ever worked for like a tutoring agency, or I guess even if you just like have clients at your company and that kind of thing, you might be familiar with like a session 0 type thing where you're establishing like what a person knows and what their expectations are of a language and that kind of thing. And that's a very common language interview practice as well. So during this kind of early intervention unit, I would inform the students that some of them would get a more in-depth interview. There would be an oral assessment measuring for general language proficiency, but not for conformity to standard English, specifically not for conformity to standard English. If a student hesitates in order to conform to standard English, that would, I don't want to say take points off, that would not meet the, they would not be showing learning for the unit, right? If they hesitated and showed language anxiety around not speaking standard English, because I have just discussed many assets of multilingualism, and there are many, many more I could discuss, but I don't want to keep you here all day. Well, I kind of do. I could talk more about this, but yeah, asset-based approach is common pedagogical practice. So that's another reason why this study is going to be targeting English language learning classrooms at first, because I don't know. I've been doing this for like 4 semesters. I don't have a PhD in English language teaching curriculum design. I don't know how to teach an asset-based perspective to multilingual students without maybe kind of alienating monolingual students, especially because, as the expression goes, when you're used to every privilege, equity looks like oppression. So addressing the assets of multilingual students might make the the concern trolling around teaching in the U.S. And critical race theory, etc., that we're making students feel bad for being white. that would be a concern at a PTA meeting of mine if I were praising multilingual students and then not talk about the very obvious assets and privileges that come with speaking a non-minoritized dialect of English. Those should be self-evident. Those are self-evident enough that when I do language interviews on students, already English language learning students, they are generally well aware that by the time they become adults, they will need to use standard English for certain things. And that's, as a teacher, how you get away with teaching non-standard English is you're gonna have to get your students to pass some kind of standardized English test. And as they learn the value of different registers of English, and as they view their own English as an asset, even if it is non-standard English, then they will possess more underlying linguistic proficiency to learn standard English and use it in the right contexts in a kind of culturally responsive and sustaining manner, rather than saying, no, the way you're doing it is wrong, you have to do it this way. Instead, it's, oh, look at how proficient you are in changing registers of English. Here's another register of English that helps you communicate with the richest, whitest people in America. So it's generally beneficial to know this register of English. Let's loop back around to charter schools for a second because I really have a bone to pick with them. My impression, having worked at that charter school, it being by far the most toxic school I've ever worked at, compared to the schools that I was student teaching at during my internships, which practiced contemporary pedagogical theory. You really got the sense that charter schools, and I've talked to other charter school teachers about this, that charter schools aim to imitate rich white private schools in their kind of aesthetics, but rich white private schools are inherently exclusionary. Accommodation for different types of students is anathema to the private school model, you know. So, of course, these kids at this charter school felt super culturally non-responded to. Their culture was deliberately being erased. It was not being sustained. And that made them mad. That made them bully each other. That made them have a whole lot of issues that I didn't see in the other schools that I taught at that practiced culturally responsive teaching and culturally sustaining pedagogy. So, what happens is, the higher up you are in the Ministry of Education, the more likely you are to have gone to a rich, white, private school, and then you go, well, I'm successful. I'm very high up in the Department of Education, and I went to a rich, white, private school. So clearly, rich, white, private schools are the way to go. They don't make the connection that maybe there is a confounding factor in the mix. Is that confounding factor or list of factors? Factors in research. Damn. not an intermediate variable. Yeah, I guess it is. It's a confounding variable, right? It's not a moderating or mediating or intervening variable. The confounding variable is that they were already rich and white, and that led to both them getting high positions in the Department of Education and to them going to rich white private schools. The two things themselves did not lead to each other. I think that doing these in-depth interviews with students will probably yield a whole lot of data that I would know what to do with when I got it. That very often happens when you collect qualitative data, like I've done when I've looked up, like found my results for like after every lesson, students have to show evidence of learning, and sometimes the evidence of the learning that they show is learning that I was not targeting, but the learning that they ended up learning was pretty interesting anyway. It definitely, I think, will lead to some interesting, because even though I have read two books by bell hooks, I'm still not 100% in touch with the experience of growing up in certain marginalized groups. And these students that I will be interviewing will have that experience, will have had that experience, and I think that's a very important part of the process, is to gather that evidence as well. One of the things I had trouble adjusting to in kind of research methodologies was the fact that we don't write in a very autobiographical style compared to the rest of critical pedagogy. Like, if you look at bell hooks and like Paulo Freire and stuff, a lot of their published books are just adaptations of their critical reflective journals from when they were teaching people who had very different experiences from their own. So hopefully the teachers who administer these in-depth language interviews to the students will be familiar with critical pedagogy and will have read Paulo Freire, and they will know how to conduct a critical reflection, because that's something I learned in my first semester, and if they don't know how to do that, that's included in the references at the bottom of my research project. Alright, what else would an English language arts teacher need? See, here's the thing. We're told that we're supposed to integrate, fluent monolinguals with English language learners, but really, lesson planning for English language learners in a monolingual normed classroom, even if a majority of the students are English language learners, it just ends up being an accommodation. It's not universal accessibility. So that would be something I would encourage teachers with English backgrounds to reflect upon in their critical reflections. Because when we have these lesson plans, there's just a little box in part of the lesson plan which says, how will you, differentiate learning and accommodate for English language learners in this lesson? And then you're supposed to just kind of imagine what words an English language learner might not know, or what expressions they might not know, or what, I don't know, certain applications of language they might not be familiar with. Whereas if you went straight to, I don't know, the horse's mouth or whatever, students, in my experience, are much better at articulating what they don't know when it comes to language than a teacher who is simply just guessing. So that's that's part of the unit. That's part of what all students will be assessed on, is how do you view English differently? How do you view your strengths and weaknesses differently within English and your other languages? But intermediate students, the handful of intermediate students who will receive a more in-depth interview will get asked that question a little bit more in depth. Probably some follow-up questions based on what sounds interesting. Like if they give if they dodge the question a little bit, or they give a kind of ambiguous answer, or if they kind of defer to the unit without giving their own perspective on how they think about language now versus how they might have before the unit. I would ask a lot of follow-up questions. I don't know if you've ever been to a therapist. They're pretty acutely aware of when you dodge a question. So maybe channel some kind of therapist as a social emotional teacher within this in-depth interview. My career generally has been teaching overseas, and I have noticed that students overseas generally tend to stick at a more kind of intermediate plateau or fossilized proficiency of English and be fine with it, than students who are immersed in English and who experience more socioeconomic pressures to conform to standard English. So kind of broadening these in-depth interviews into other schools with other English language learners, especially in other parts of the world. Eventually you would get generalizable information from that, I hope. It would take a long time, because you are operating with these very heavily qualitative interviews in pretty short batches, unless you are teaching at a school that is primarily English language learners, which is more likely to be overseas. I think that would result in some steps for intervening into those students' conceptions of English that would be different from how students in the US conceive of English when they do have these, when they are, number one, fully immersed, so they might just move beyond the intermediate plateau simply by hanging around fluent English speakers in an English-speaking country. And number two, like I said, experience these social and economic pressures to conform to standardized English. Man, I should probably talk more about this, right? Let me see, is there anything else I want to talk about? Or should I just say goodnight? And hope you had a relaxing experience. Let me see. Stereotype threat and language anxiety. Fossilization. I'm going through all my references now. Multiglossia and the learning of Arabic as a heritage language. Ideological and socio-cultural motivations from the Critical Multilingualism Studies Journal. I could just recommend that you read Edward Said's Orientalism. A foundational text in the formation of the other. Really improve your critical reflection game. But it's also impossible to read, really long and extraordinarily dry. But maybe I could just make all the teachers who administer this this research read Orientalism in order to make more people read Orientalism. And then of course you get to journal articles I'm citing about how natives, like problematizing the notion of a native speaker in general, and these are decades old. Sociolinguistics is dates back to the 70s, kind of where basically sociolinguistics is where linguists started realizing, hey, maybe we're kind of racist when we talk about stuff. Like, there's literally one very early sociolinguistic study where they interview people of different socioeconomic statuses about concepts of God, and then they linguistically decode these concepts of God, and they go, oh, people who have a more limited vocabulary in standard English have just as sophisticated concepts about God as, someone who's more educated and more articulate about God by normal standards. But I hope I pointed out the many political and cultural motivations behind not acknowledging that the way that most people conceive of and approach language is, pretty racist. racist and discriminatory and othering. So we have, like more than 50 years of research at this point. And because of political motivations, it's even more difficult to bring this stuff into the classroom than it is to bring, ordinary innovations into the classroom, which already often takes, like a decade after those innovations are discovered. I certainly could have benefited from a lot of the stuff that I learned about. I learned a lot of the reasons why I'm so neurotic from school, and how I might not have been so neurotic if I had received more differentiated instruction. Let's see. I'm realizing that this is a 2-hour-long ASMR session, but that's actually a very normal length for an ASMR video, because you're supposed to put it on the background and use it to relax, and I hope my microphone settings are appropriate for that, and that my computer fan is not too loud, and that I am not too quiet. Oh, yeah, just read Bell Hooks' Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. I could explain that more. I could explain why you should do that a little bit more. It really does overlap with the concepts of cultural hegemony. And bilingual students needing to learn more registers than monolingual students, because as she talks about margin and center, those at the margin need to understand centered identities in order to appease them. Centered identities do not need to understand marginalized identities, because they do not need to act in any deferential way towards marginalized identities. So that's another asset that a marginalized identity would have, would be that they understand, they or we, depending on which identity you're talking about, understand the perspective of those who other them. Franz von Noln wrote The Wretched of the Earth. He talks a little bit about he talks a lot about masking and performing as a centered group. Even if you are a marginalized group, his works are central to decolonizing theory, and like I said, if you can stop the colonizing process, it kind of starts reversing. So you could read some Franz von Noln. The book I cite here is The Wretched of the Earth, where he does discuss the use of language, in this case French, which is even worse than English, because it's French, about how French is used to oppress people in the Caribbean. I can also recommend Duncan Andrade's book, The Art of Critical Pedagogy, because that gets into the idea that education in the US requires winners and losers, as if you can win and lose at learning. I believe that's another cultural bias that we certainly take for granted in the US. That's something you need to look at with a critical lens, and I don't know, maybe that's something I would write up for teachers who do not have a background in critical pedagogy, who are administering this unit and this research. I don't know, man. My German student is Spanish-English bilingual, and he's okay. Like a little bit of the Dunning-Kruger effect. He's aware of what he doesn't know. Monolingual students don't really understand the process of learning a language as well as he does. So he's constantly underestimating himself, and I am constantly reassuring him of notions such as a common underlying language proficiency, and even the fact that like monolingual speakers will frequently not necessarily even know the words in English that they're learning in a new language, or they won't have the cultural frame of reference to understand what they're learning in a new language. Something I can appreciate about teaching a bilingual student is that he does not see it as a huge weakness when I cannot immediately translate a word, because he is aware that translation is a separate skill from, proficiency in multiple languages. And that's another thing that I would like to note to those who are conducting an in-depth interview is, if a student is looking for a direct translation, that is another indicator that they are not showing learning for the unit. They shouldn't be looking for exact translations. They should be looking for ways to articulate themselves and make themselves understood, using concepts in their other languages, and using simplifying concepts rather than using, $10 words or whatever. I should say just words that show up on a vocabulary test and that kind of thing. But for me, because I don't take the access test, and German belongs to the Common European Reference Framework for Languages, instead of 2 and 3 on the access scores, it's levels like it's between B1 and B2 on the CEFR, Common European Framework Reference. And if I were to extend the study into Europe, I would certainly translate the proficiencies of 2 or 3 on an access score to the CEFR between B1 and B2. I don't know, man. What else is there to say? There's a lot. But I'd be retreading a lot of stuff to hammer home some points, so I think I'm gonna leave it at that and say goodnight, because we are past the 2-hour mark. So hopefully you had a very relaxing time listening to my ASMR channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell because that helps. And if there's anything that you think I forgot, please put that in the comments below. I'm interested in your experience as a monolingual or as a multilingual. Going through these common underlying proficiency situations, or maybe you consider yourself to have a uncommon overlying lack of proficiency. I don't know. I would say that I know a lot of bilinguals or multilinguals who feel that way, who do not view the kind of space between languages that they possess as an asset. Let me see, actually. Okay, one more thing. I will look at my unit plan for... because I covered a lot of the lesson objectives in that unit. Okay, this is a lot. Getting them to rate Shakespeare and telling them why isn't Shakespeare wrong if it's so different. Noting assets themselves if they are advanced enough of their specific dialect. What else? Oh man, there's so much other stuff I wrote. I'm so sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm good. See you guys next time in my next video. Hopefully this one doesn't get demonetized because I talk so much about white